Thank you, everyone. This is really exciting for me to get to be a part of this conversation. I think you all are really at the frontier of your growth regions, but also at the frontier of a lot of this thinking of urban development. And there's many different skills and disciplines in the room, different networks that are all collaborating to sort of figure this out together. And so, how you figure out what place-led development is, how you create places in these growing areas is one of the big challenges, and something that is a challenge around the world in our networks. And frankly, I think you guys have more potential to do this right, and have some more good examples than other parts of the world, but certainly a lot further to go. So I'm really excited to be connected to your learning journey and want to be part of this conversation, and with many of the experts here in the room. And I would like to again acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, but also the land of all the areas that you all represent and are growing into. We recently had a placemaking week in New Zealand that was led by some Maori people. There was a Maori woman that said, we don't only need placemaking to be represent and acknowledge Indigenous people. We need all placemaking to be Indigenous. We need to help everyone to feel more Indigenous to this place, to make it a better place, to make us better custodians of the land as well. But also to make Indigenous populations feel welcome, more compatible with the process of shaping places, the more storied, informal culture of places, and the process and the governance of how they're shaped. And I think that also rings true for a lot of these immigrant populations that are coming in from different parts of the world. How do we make them feel welcome, but how do we also benefit from the different cultures, the plural cultures that you all have a wealth of in this country? How do we make sure that what could lead to some conflicts, how do we use place and placemaking as a means to bring together and help people listen to each other, bridge difference, but also benefit from these differences? So I'm going to talk about how Australia is really excelling at livability. You have the most livable cities in the world by many rankings, and actually your CBDs are doing quite well. But that approach to livability correlates with high-cost environment, sometimes exclusionary environment in terms of not just cost, but the culture of the spaces. And it's expensive to keep delivering on that way. And how focusing on lovable places may be the next challenge for you all, creating place attachment as a driver of economic development, of job attachment, of creating places that bridge difference and build on diversity as well, but also build respectful communities of the culture and context and environment. So I think that focusing on lovable places may help you achieve livability more affordably, more inclusively, even more quickly, and is more compatible with some of the growth areas in a way that you're involved with. And place attachment is something that actually appeals to sort of more conservative parts of the world. So how we do that, and how we not just deliver places, but build the capacity of people to deliver these places themselves, which ultimately creates better places. And again, it's not just engaging people because it's the right thing to do, it's because what will deliver better products. So the focus on place, we think, is really going back to sort of a common sense approach to how we really created the places we most love in the world, the main streets, the places that we're most proud of on all scales, were created in a way through a place-led approach where every participant, every business owner, every pedestrian is almost competing to contribute to the shared value of other people in that community. Yet right now, the sort of dominant paradigm of development, of urbanization around the world is actually competing to take value from place. And this is often most apparent in the growth areas around the world, where we're doing one-off developments that are more about private experience, more about the private car, more about single-use development, single industries that often degrade place. And so we even within our different disciplines, whether we care about good design or good transportation or health and well-being, we're addressing these issues independently of each other, and in ways that sometimes degrade place, but definitely don't leverage it. So we see this, but there's also this convergence of causes around the world that are whether again at a community scale around a main street in a rural area or globally. We often work with people coming to the cause of place from certain different passions. People come because they're passionate about arts and culture, or historic preservation, or participation in governance, or local food. And we're seeing how a focus on place can bring together these causes for more systemic change, a more resourceful approach, and for deeper collaboration. We're not addressing these causes enough by focusing on them alone. It's the silos that I'll keep coming back to. They're limiting place, but also place as a means to break these down and bring people together in a comfortable, common sense way, across difference, across silos. But right now, if you Google the future of cities, it looks a lot like this. It's actually, most of the images look a lot like this. It's a scary thing to some people, but it's also been drilled into the backs of our minds as the future is this monoculture of place, is about objects, is about sort of green. We've been told this is environmental, it's social, but it's actually not. It is not a sustainable environment. This is what American architects are building in China and the Middle East, and when you see it actually built, it's not working at a place level. This is very late stage innovation, late stage economy, not about people, culture, place, not indigenous for sure, not compatible with those cultures. And this is out my window in Jakarta not too long ago. It looks a lot like that, but it doesn't work. And you can't walk in amongst these buildings. This is the center of the city there. So if you lead with design and development, you get design development. If you lead with the narrow solution set of any discipline or any department in a city, we limit the outcomes. We limit the demand for that discipline. We limit the demand for that department. We limit the potential to leverage those skills and those investments. Transportation engineers, we think have done perhaps the most damage, but they've been asked to solve the wrong problems. If we ask them to create places, build communities, they're actually really good at it, sometimes better than some of the other disciplines that are too caught up in the sort of art or ego of their discipline. So if you plan for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. And of course, that's leading a negative type of growth in our outer areas. It's inducing sprawl, inducing sort of more of a private experiencing, and really egregiously raising the cost of living for some of the lowest income people that are forced to live further and further out in these cities. If you add, there's these new calculators in the States that show if you add the cost of transportation to housing, how completely unaffordable it is to live in near cities in the U.S. And this also connects to, I think, an underlying crisis that's reflected in how youth experience our communities. And if you go back, this study's been done, I don't know if it's been done in Australia, but it's been done in many parts of the world, looking at the radius around the home that 9-year-old children are allowed to roam without adult supervision. I have a 9-year-old son. He's just finally allowed to cross the streets in Brooklyn now. But it's in many parts of the world, it's been reduced 90% each of the last 3 generations. So that to me is the indicator of the larger environmental crisis. If people don't feel a connection to and responsibility for the world beyond their home, how are they going to ramp on to greater stewardship and ownership of these lands and of consciousness of the world beyond that? So that this fear of safety is, we used to be afraid of crime or other people, but people are afraid of the car in many cases, of crossing the street. We've designed children out of our communities. We also, two of the biggest complaints for these growth areas and rural areas are that children are loitering, children are gathering in places, and then the other crisis is that children don't want to live there after they've graduated from high school. So we've designed kids out of our communities, and we're crying when they don't want to stay there anymore. So they're not creating place attachment. They're not feeling welcome in our cities. So we have to lead with people and places to get places that are loved, to get lovable places. It's not being about against the car or against traffic engineers or against developers or against architects. It's being for places and leveraging all their skills and their resources to create great places. It's a challenge that is common sense, but it's not how not how we measure our success, not how we organize our governance. It's not how we build our participation models, but it's how communities think more subconsciously and how they can. We have lots of tools that can be engaged, and and there's groups, and I see is that Dean Cracknell, the town teams movement is figuring this out in a really exciting way. I'm excited to get to connect. Thanks to this conference for connecting us on this as well. So the city we've actually worked the most in is Detroit. And I'm not going to go into it here, but it's a city that failed in its growth. In Michigan in general, has failed in every big economic development, top-down, silver bullet approach to economic development, and had the biggest impact of the economic global financial crisis. But it's the state, because of that, that's now leading on placemaking in the U.S. They're leading on building around existing assets and existing people to create places in all contexts. We put this beach in the week that Detroit declared bankruptcy, and this beach became the anchor for the revitalization of downtown Detroit, which is now one of the most successful turnaround stories in the U.S. And it's this city that people who have lived there a long time, but also people that are moving there, want to be part of to help create. Not because it's a better city, it doesn't have better facilities and a better government than many cities. It's quite problematic still, but there's this buzz that you can make a difference there. You can shape the place, you can shape the economy, you can shape the culture. And again, I think, so growth areas, that's one of your comparative advantages. Not just that you're more affordable, Detroit's plenty affordable, but that people can shape them. That you can invite people to help co-create these places and create the identity, the culture of them, add to the existing identity and culture. So you have to leverage that. Just being successful because you're more affordable or you have area to grow, you're missing the larger opportunity. So we shape our public spaces thereafter. Our public spaces shape us. This is, I think, George Street in Sydney. My father took this picture 30 years ago. He gave it to the Lord Mayor at the time, and the Lord Mayor put it in his office saying that the traffic engineers answer to a different God. He didn't have control over this, but I think there's finally light rail down this street. But this is why people don't go downtown again, and frankly, why people have moved out of the CBDs in the 80s and 90s and went to malls because it was safer to do that. But now CBDs are getting this. They're getting that that's not a safe environment, and this is a placemaking leader in Auckland, and where they're pedestrianizing Queen Street here, and there's a Barnes Dance crosswalk here, and in the middle of the street, in the middle of Auckland, she bumps into a friend and gets a hug. So how do we create places where this kind of connection, this kind of social comfort is possible? How we don't realize the extent to which we're shaping our places, but they also shape us. They shape our social connections, our capacity to continue to shape places and contribute to them. So just as disciplines are in silos and different departments are in silos, so are community institutions. And I think this is particularly true with suburban areas and growth areas. We tend to spend a lot of money on facilities, but they're isolated from each other. We build a playground out here. We have a coffee shop over there. We build sports facilities, a transit stop, a library. And these are often very expensive projects, and they may be beautiful architecture and high-quality facilities, but if we're just doing them as standalone projects, they're not necessarily creating places. They're definitely not being leveraged to do that. So we see, increasingly though, people here see placemaking and place management as valuable and necessary, and are starting to leverage these projects a little bit, making them connected to their place, engage people, program them. But we think the future really has to be about leading with hubs, especially these growth areas, whether retrofitting growth areas or drawing investment in new ones. We have to think about creating these multi-use hubs and destinations that draw together many investments to add to each other. So food, health, markets, squares, parks, schoolyards, these all have to be looked at as multi-use spaces. That not just because it's more efficient, but because that's how the magic of places starts to emerge. So we're seeing this evolution of the development process from what we call project-driven to place-led. I actually developed this diagram with the CEO of then Adelaide, now he's the CEO of Port Phillip, Peter Smith. Been working with him a lot over the years on developing models for place-led governance. But this is something we've been practicing for a long time, is that we need to move beyond just project-driven is let's get the efficient infrastructure delivered, let's get let's do the engineering right. Discipline-led is, okay, let's get better quality design, better quality experts, maybe some people from afar, builds a little more value. Place-sensitive is let's engage across disciplines, let's engage the community, let's be responsive to culture, context, history. But we think the goal at least has to be place-led. Creating great places that people love and building the capacity of communities to shape them. In creating that, putting in practice that virtuous cycle of placemaking, capacity building, focusing on places, and reversing the cycle of degrading places. And so, we're seeing this happening a lot, I think more in Australia than anywhere else. So, you should be proud of where you're at, but you have to go a lot further. So I do think you have a lot of the best architecture in the world. We're very critical of architects and we're very critical of developers. This is Circular Quay in Sydney. This is a very informal public space that feels welcoming and public to many. And this is a fancy bank building. And to have these types of things be able to coexist is exciting. So we see this as place-led development. And a developer friend of mine in Chile says that successful public spaces are the new anchor tenant. And so there's more examples of this actually in Australia than anywhere else, and of how developers lead with a public space to drive the market and make development viable where it wouldn't otherwise be, but also make it a place that reflects and builds the local identity, doesn't just extract it. So, but we need to scale this up, and frankly, we need these models for the other parts of the world. We need to show what Australia is doing to help global urbanization patterns in Africa and Asia. Last week, we just launched a placemaking network for people all over Asia, but they need the models from you all to figure this out. So how do you frame this? How do you engage people in this conversation and apply this at many scales strategically? We have this tool called the Power of 10, where we say this is how we apply it in New York, but it really actually makes even more sense applying to a growth area or regional area. We think a good region has at least 10 major destinations. And in learning from New York, we got to work in many of these public spaces, but we think it's the process and the management that needs to be learned from, most importantly. Not too often people copy the High Line or the Central Park, or they copy the form or the brand rather than how these spaces emerge. And really each of these public destinations works at the destination scale and then at the place scale. So a great destination, and so we've worked a lot on the Perth Cultural Center, which I won't go into here, but it's sort of an example where our goal was to create actually 40 places, each with 10 things to do in it. We did a detailed plan, but they didn't follow it. They actually did much better. They just started, it was more organizing all the different cultural institutions to turn themselves inside out and start activating the places around it. But the cities, regions, towns fail and succeed at the human scale, at the scale of interaction. Really at the scale of this room. So at the scale at which people make eye contact, the scale at which people are aware of, sort of acknowledge each other's presence, or have some responsibility for each other's presence. And so it's that triangulation of purpose in a space that's key. So having a playground, but where parents can get something to eat and drink, all of a sudden that becomes a destination where people come from a lot further away than just a standard suburban park that doesn't have any spin-off activities around it. So we've done this Power 10 tool in many places. The first time I did it in Australia, 2007, it was in Melbourne with the different councils, different departments that hadn't even talked together. And Melbourne's really famous for doing great urban design. They do a wonderful job, but because it was so good, they were blocking the other departments that also had great skills and resources for placemaking. So it's always key. Whoever's leading placemaking is often great. We want to celebrate that. But we also always have to recognize that they're blocking other sectors, other disciplines, other demographics. So it's always about diversifying, balancing who's involved in placemaking. So with Melbourne, while it had great quality built environment, very livable, the lovable places, these green dots, were actually rather limited to these small areas. And those were the places that the tourism department also said they're only spending half a day, tourists, and going to these 3 or 4 places, the Vic Market, Fed Square, laneways, and so forth. They hadn't really had the goal of creating great places that people love. Or it hadn't been fully, these yellow dots were opportunity places. So with regional planning too, where are the people's favorite places, where are the opportunity places, where are the places people avoid? Really focus on these key destinations. Also focus on the typology of streets. We think we need to have a broader hierarchy of not just roads, but creating streets. Rural areas need destination streets. All areas need a full spectrum of street outcomes, and residential communities should be able to discuss what their outcomes of the streets they'd like to achieve. Do they want kids, their 9-year-old children, to be able to walk across them unattended? Do they want these places to be healthy, connected communities, and so forth? So it shouldn't just be determined by the level of service of the roads, of how fast cars should be allowed to go on them, but other outcomes. And then you start to think more holistically about those streets. A couple quick examples of sort of growth area developments that I've gotten to play small roles on a long time ago. This is Sunshine Coast. I was actually here a couple weeks ago doing another training for them. They're trying to make sure the downtown works, especially with all this growth area. It is really key that you're lucky the CBDs of many of your growth areas are really thriving, but you need to make areas further out in cities. You do need to make the center and lots of centers work. So it is key to Jane Jacobs, The Economy of Cities, really made a strong case for why downtowns really do drive regional success. So we can't ignore that. But there's a nested set of downtowns. You need lots of different cores, and obviously we need more hubs and cores in the regional areas now as well. And so Sunshine Coast is trying to create that downtown to make sure that succeeds. But then as these new regional cores emerge as well. So Aura, we worked with them at the beginning to talk about how they could lead their development with the Power of 10, with public places that sell it that way, market it as places that people can help shape, not just as a place you live, work, play, or you consume, and how the process of building that can build the governance capacity, the participation and ownership of the spaces. Make sure you really triangulate things. Again, architects, planners, landscape architects tend to space things out too much, sort of to distribute everything rather than clustering around these key destinations. So I didn't get to actually see it, but it looks like it's one of your more world-leading projects, and probably with a lot further to go. Rouse Hill Town Center is another one we worked on a long time ago, which really broke a lot of ground for what a shopping center could be, leaving the public areas owned by the council, managing them, creating these tight streets, in a very what was the time of total greenfield site. And then how that drew development that added to place and added to that destination and made transit feasible. It's built transit out there as well. But it all centered around a very small square. So it's at this human scale that places fail and succeed. And this, with the Power of 10 idea, had many different places within it that get people circulating throughout. So what makes a great place? So PPS started in the 70s. It was actually founded by my father. He'd founded the first Earth Day in New York City in 1970, but he realized that environmental movement wasn't looking enough at the human connection between people and place and at cities. And we need to make the connection work at cities and make cities work to be able to address the larger environmental crisis. We started looking at really human interaction, really analyzing users of spaces. We became sort of experts in that. But then we realized in about the 90s that more important than us being experts was how we could build the capacity of communities to be experts and do this work themselves. And that's when we developed this focus on place and developed the idea of placemaking to help communities realize they are experts in places and to give them the tools to realize that expertise and apply it. So we have people evaluate a place based on sociability, uses and activities, comfort and image, access and linkages. This helps them take off their hat as the one thing they always complain about or the one issue they always have, and also that gets disciplines to take off their hat of sort of their solution set or the baggage they come in with. And there's measurable ways at evaluating these and more intuitive ways. But more recently we found that these qualities also correlate with place attachment. This Knight Foundation, Soul of the Community study, wanted to find what led people to be attached to a community. They found that that they thought that it was going to be things like good health care, schools, sort of economic growth, and sort of the livability criteria. They found no correlation between those, almost no correlation, but really high correlation between three qualities: opportunities for social engagement, fun things to do; openness to all kinds of people, so places that are welcoming; and then aesthetics, beauty. it did find that aesthetics alone would never lead to attachment. So just being a beautiful place, just like being a beautiful person, people don't develop love just for people that they're beautiful. They also develop a love for people they like to engage with socially and they feel welcome towards. So this lovability became a focus, and when the people running this survey from the Gallup organization and the Knight Foundation realized this, they'd never heard of placemaking. They realized placemaking was a means to create place attachment. They also found that when there's higher place attachment, it caused higher economic growth, and it caused higher entrepreneurship rates. You're more likely to invest in the long term in a space, in a community if you're attached to it. And I also think you're probably, we can't necessarily prove this, but it seems obvious that if you're more attached to a place, you're going to invest in ways that contribute to the place. You're going to develop businesses that keep the money in that community, that activate the streets, that build social relationships in these communities, not the chain stores or the sort of more extractive type of retail or development. So placemaking, sort of emerged as in the last 20 years as as a strategy to break down silos, to build the capacity of communities. There's many definitions, and frankly, the definition is kind of evolving and fuzzy, and that's useful. Debating what placemaking is and who does it is part of the placemaking process. MIT did a study on it that found that the biggest benefit of it is that it strengthens the connections between people in the places they share. It builds social capital, it builds capacity. But one definition is that it's a collaborative process by which we can shape our public realm in order to maximize shared value. So, but we think all placemaking campaigns should be at least have these three different dimensions to it. They're focusing on places, on activating places, and activation does ground it. It does make it real. It's not so abstract. It's not planning. It's doing. And we've gotten to apply placemaking projects in many contexts all over the world. And we've worked a ton on Harvard's campus, and I mentioned the Perth project, and we've done demonstration projects in most of the major capital cities here in Australia. But we think you also have to be looking at systemic change. If we're just activating, if we're just improving some places, we can be perpetuating the existing status quo. We have to look at how place builds new place-led models for governance, development, financing of cities, of urbanization, and how it brings together new causes, new constituents, and balances it. Make sure everyone's, no one sector or demographics dominating the process or the place. And then it has to be building a movement, building a capacity, building a network. And so around each project, around each community or each city, and globally, we want to build networks. Now, and that's one of the main reasons I'm actually here for several weeks in Australia, is to sort of build these regional networks. And so some of the partners here are gathering on Wednesday evening to build a regional network in Perth. And we're doing some similar events in other cities around Australia to get a diverse group of placemaking leaders to define and grow the conversation, the movement, the impact in each place. And then gathering at the end of the trip on December 6th, placemaking leaders from around the country. So we have a lot of placemaking leaders from all over the world. This is the last 5 years of placemaking conferences. We just came from the Kuala Lumpur and Penang last year, where we connected people from around Asia to launch a placemaking network for Asia. So every part of the world, though, is leading the placemaking conversation from one sector, but also blocking. So we're always trying to figure out how to diversify it. Some are missing. There weren't many private sector people involved in the Nairobi conference or the Kuala Lumpur conference with the UN Habitat. But the private sector is shaping cities. So we need to diversify these efforts. And Europe probably has the strongest placemaking network with representation from many different countries, most of the countries there. And they have a network with tools and resources and case studies, a website. Latin America has just gathered 1,700 people in Lima in August for our third Placemaking Latino America conference. We just had a Canadian one in Halifax. We've had several there. PPS had our placemaking conference in Chattanooga, focused really on equity and inclusion issues and race issues with placemaking that have become rightfully very important in the U.S. There's the Asian one. New Zealand has a very strong placemaking network. But again, really respectful and building on more indigenous connections to place in the land. Led by Panuku Development Corporation, that's really trying to do place-led development in the Auckland region, again to drive investment and population on the terms of existing communities around public destinations. And then we kicked off this conversation a few weeks ago in Townsville with the first placemaking week there. We're going to do another big placemaking week in Sydney about this time next year. So placemaking is a word. It's becoming, it's sort of trendy. It means different things to different people, but it's actually being used fairly equally around the world on social media. And it has these roots in the work of Jane Jacobs and William White, who helped, who Project for Public Spaces was set up to put their work into practice. My father worked on the Street Life Project with William White, and we started thinking of placemaking as a global movement 5 to 10 years ago. And, but in the last year, it's really just started to self-organize with people leading it in different ways in more decentralized efforts. So that's why we're launching Placemaking X this year to really highlight the leadership, the innovation, frankly, that's, it's coming from many people in Australia. There's a higher density of leadership and great models and conferences in Australia than anywhere else by far. So that's why I'm here to sort of learn from and connect and highlight your expertise, your success, and share that globally to encourage the U.S. and other parts of the world to follow. It's not that you have figured it out, but it's your approach to figuring it out that's most important, that the potential for the models to keep emerging here are the most powerful. So we really launched this movement with this idea that everyone has the right to live in a great place, but more importantly, everyone has the right to contribute to making to the place where they already live great. So again, you're going to best provide great places in your growth areas by challenging and supporting people to contribute to making those places work, not just by delivering them. And that's where you're going to create the buzz and the brand too, the feeling that people can shape those. So I think you can do that through what we call lighter, quicker, cheaper approaches. Often, it's not delivering necessarily big infrastructure. At the outset, it's more temporary infrastructure. This was a town in a couple hours outside of New York City that was one of the declining growth areas. They wanted a destination. The downtown had been raised because a mall had failed, and a mall was there for 20 years and failed. And they had a lot of Italian immigrants and Polish immigrants that remembered what a piazza was like. The development wasn't feasible at the outset, but they thought that if they started to test creating a square there and get people to sign up saying they would invest downtown if everyone else did. They called it crowdsourced placemaking, sort of driving demand where it didn't exist before. They did these temporary activations just basically where they remembered what it was like to be part of a downtown. People know how to do this. They know how to be part of this. The community only had a few $1,000s to get this started. It was all donated, all volunteer, different hobbyists bringing out their cars, artists, every business throughout the town wanted to be part of this, donating some food, contributing in different ways. The artists were designing, painting all the things that lasted, and so forth. So this sort of creativity, this resourcefulness, playfulness, people have these skills. They just need to be brought together to showcase this and to reimagine what a downtown can be like. So I'm going to try to wrap up, but placemaking is about a process. It's about turning the process inside out to start with people and places. But the most important thing is it builds capacity to further build process. So how it builds governance capacity, how it breaks down silos between different governance sectors is important. I think we sort of talked about this a little bit, but how each department needs to measure their success more differently, and how place and placemaking needs to be not just a separate department. Sometimes that makes sense for a little while, but ultimately it needs to be everybody's job and the community's job to create places. And place-led governance, moving in that direction, starts to evaluate your metrics of success around place outcomes, not just siloed outcomes, and about how you build capacity of communities around more of the district scale to do placemaking. We learned about this most in Adelaide, Australia, where we launched with a very top-down program of activation. But the point of it was to test and build capacity for these teams and around districts. There wasn't, Australia doesn't have as much capacity for, the merchants aren't as engaged, unfortunately, and the communities aren't as engaged. So there's a real need to build that capacity. You can't just do it overnight. We did the Power of 10 tools, there's place game tools, to get good data, but more importantly, to start having people have these conversations and listen to each other and see themselves as responsible for their public realms. So placemaking became a whole cross-council strategy, starting with a placemaking team, but that has since been dissipated into the city, but the program is continuing. And Callum, if he's here, is a real expert. He's coming later if he's not. Oh, there, he's way in the back. Yeah, he actually did this, and he's an expert. He, presents on how this actually got applied, and I think it's one of the. We've present this all over the world. It's one of the most inspiring learning models for place-led governance. So lastly, we've been working with the Brookings Institution for the last few years to connect economy shaping with place shaping. We realized we were sort of blind to some of the economic angles of this, but they also realized that they were blind to the place focuses. They were looking at agglomeration and what leads to innovation. So we realized we have to connect these. Placemaking is a way to, so innovation is to economy shaping what placemaking is to the built environment shaping. And they realize the limiting factor in innovation districts is collisionable activity, getting people to bump into each other, have collective ownership, making sure they spend their money and stay and become attached to their communities. The bump rates are a big focus. Social density, a vibrant public realm acts like density. We think social density is not as correlated to real density as people think. We see social density on rural main streets. We see no social density in some of the densest residential neighborhoods in the world, and even if you do have a lot of density, we still think you need to lead with social density to make sure that new density, new development adds to place, adds to a public experience of that space, and its social density is also key to these innovation districts, innovation hubs. A lot of these are place deserts as well. Place deserts are when people have no attachment and there's no places to gather and develop that attachment. So we need to democratize innovation through placemaking. Democratize the impacts of the innovation economy, make sure the investments stay, make sure people spend money in ways that have more inclusive benefits. We need these innovation hubs are the focus, but what an innovation hub needs to be broader. We need to look at libraries and other community institutions as potential innovation hubs in rural communities, and we need to show how all kinds of businesses can be part of an innovation economy in some sense, while recognizing that there are innovative industries that are building, much bigger, higher paid jobs and bigger economic impact that we do need to invest in as well. So, sort of closing out, the power of placemaking is that it localizes, makes places special and unique. It creates a magnet for workers, residents. It builds social capital and place capital. It's economic development and community development. You can do a whole strategy. People can have impact in front of their home, creating places. But the destination, city, region, country, this power of 10 can be applied to many scales to have a real big impact. And we want Australia to have 10 great examples of place-led, area development, area growth, growth areas that can be applied elsewhere and learn from. So we want you all to compete. We need the different, Swan and Wanneroo to be competing, to be the best place-led council. We want you all to be part of this Placemaking X network that accelerates this learning, connects you all to each other, realizes that we all have pieces of this. But to really save the world for people, we need to figure this out quickly. We're not accomplishing we're not going to keep living on this planet if we don't figure out how to better connect to place and to each other, build the models where adding and leading with place drives a thriving community, drives human happiness and creativity. We're not going to address the environmental crisis by just impacting less. We're going to address it by creating places that people love and become stewards and co-creators of a healthy, sustainable built environment. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I have a minute or two left for questions. I do. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and Kelly has a microphone. So if you'd like to kick us off.
Hello. Hi, Ethan. Luis from City of Armadale. I'll try to make this one really quick. I'm an economic development practitioner. I've been delivering economic development initiatives in Perth and Fremantle in the last 10 years. Placemaking has been the thing that we've been justifying for many, many years, trying to bring events, activities, markets, food trucks, reduce red tape, new policies to support. In town centres or city centres, it's mainly small businesses. That's where the majority of our community is, particularly when you are talking about a main street in Fremantle. You have mainly small businesses. Same in Perth, when you talk about the pedestrian malls, it's mainly businesses. So the question here, in those town centres that are looking at, they have a long-term vision for revitalisation. They have big plans. They have big multi-million projects that they want to achieve. They've been delivering placemaking activities. We've all done markets. We've all done food trucks. But those businesses on the ground continue to suffer. Like, delivering these economic outcomes in the last 5 years in Western Australia have been very difficult. Shops continue to close down no matter how much money you are throwing at place activation. Yeah. So how long does it take before you make that call and say, okay, we need to change this town centre radically? It's not about just throwing more events. Mm-hmm. But to achieve the vision that we have, it's a 20-year vision. So what happens between now and that 20-year vision?
So I agree with you that I think the small businesses are really the building block under which the successful public realms and places grow. And the best public spaces in the world are, the most important factor are the edges, actually. Like, it was the main street or a square, and it's how small businesses add to that. I do think you don't have the best small business quality in a lot of Australian communities. It needs to be invested in and supported. It's also hidden often. The main streets, it's often hidden by the overhangs. It's sometimes hidden by beautiful urban design too. We have to make our streets more about people and product, and allowing the best streets in the world are where are more like markets, actually. I mean, so we've been creating these events that to sort of model what a good market, what a good street is, but then it doesn't inform and benefit a street on a more regular basis. So we think a healthy city has a full spectrum of sort of informal to formal retail, and the whole city feels more like a market. In a market, every vendor is sort of competing to contribute to the shared experience, to be the most beautiful, to be the most social, friendly. They're right out in front talking to people. Rather on too many of these main streets, people are hiding in the back of the stores. You can't see through the windows. It's not as socially engaging. We need to events, though, aren't sustainable. They're a way to seed places. They're a way to build energy. But the point of them really should be seen, just like the Splash Adelaide program, as a way to build capacity for the existing community to do placemaking themselves, to take more responsibility. I think that that councils actually do a really good job at placemaking here. And delivering places but they have to shift sometimes too good a job. Sometimes you have to also be building the capacity of communities to co-deliver with you to make these sustainable. You need to organize the merchants better, train them. Sometimes offer subsidies or matching grants to them is a really important effort. But yeah, this is the building block at that scale. Those models with the merchants that regions succeed and fail, I think. Yeah. Yeah, other thoughts or questions?
Other questions? I've got, I'll just sort of, thanks. I really liked the points around silos, and I think, we see that even from NGAA's perspective of when we're trying to talk about placemaking or economic development or transport infrastructure, even within our member councils, it's hard to find the right people and they're not talking to each other and that sort of thing. So any advice for local government who might be doing some great work or might be starting out on this path? How would you approach those silos?
Totally, yeah. First of all, I think it's so cool that NGAA is in a position to be a silo buster yourself by focusing on place, and you're sort of looking at place at this very macro level. So we need to be looking at it from both levels and how you can connect other networks of councils in this way. But yeah, so place is a conversation that allows people to be, very, allows the conversation to be grounded, common sense, but also actionable. So I do think, while we're talking at big regions, I do think the way to really reinvent the capacity in the conversation is to focus on small places. And these programs like the Splash Adelaide program of giving small grants, getting action on the ground, having conversations, frankly, having some conflict, some debate, but some discussion about what your place is key. I think when are people defending, when there's some sort of conservative forces defending a place, focusing on heritage or preventing it from changing, that means that people care and they love a place. They need to be supported and challenged to have a vision for proactively improving that place to attract people on their terms. We say the best way to prevent your community from changing for the worse is to have a vision for what you want it to be and start working towards that. And people, new investment, new people coming in will respect that and they'll want to add to it and they'll conform to it a little bit. So focusing on place is a way to mitigate the negative impacts of growth and leverage the positive.
Are there any other? Yep, question from Maria.
Hi Ethan, thanks for that presentation. Maria Cook from the City of Kwinana. In my role as a planner, we often are dealing with basically greenfield developments. So that means there is no community in a lot of our growth areas. And so we're starting from scratch with a lot of the principles that we talk about and you've mentioned about co-location and urban design leading the way, and without that people focus. I guess my question, I think you touched on it slightly, was more about the private sector and the development industry, and I've seen it both in Victoria and WA, and how a significant role that they play in shaping the space, which then you need to create that connection and lovability with. I'm just wondering how you, in your experience, have worked with that industry and what sort of tips you have for us as local government working in that space.
I think that is one of the big challenges to figure out, and I do think you have some leading examples of it here, but there's a lot further to go and figure that out. We say it takes a place to create a community and a community to create a place. So you start with, even when there's no development, there's place is adding purpose and meaning to space. So you figure out where there's some existing purposes and meanings, and you look, what are the existing assets, and you grow that a little bit, and then you build a community around that, and they improve that place, add more purpose and meaning to that space. You build a master plan that supports it. Leading with the master plans, sometimes squashes that a little bit. So even when we're given a master plan, we look at how to make sure the public spaces work, and you can benchmark different spaces, from the best streets and main, and squares and parks around the world. Not just looking at the form, but on the process through which they're going to emerge and how they're governed. Obviously, the more you can build, as you build those places in the communities around them, how those communities become co-creators of them, how the public sector does maintain some ownership, some involvement, but also, we do want people to devolve. The best public spaces in the world are self-governed, self-managed in a sense. People behave in a way almost they know how to behave. Even tourists behave better in good places. So ultimately, it's not about too much, top-down control either from the private sector or the council. It's about supporting place-led governance at that community scale. Yes, we do need better learning networks for this. The developers are pretty open to these ideas. They like the idea of driving the market with place. It makes a lot of sense to them because they need to, they want to be distinguished. They want the brand to emerge more organically. They want these places to succeed. They're just motivated to sort of doing it the same way it's been done before because it's easier to copy the last best model. So we really need to figure out what are the leading edges of place-led development with the private sector, and push them further, and build on them and push them further. And it is the public sector's role to do that.